Hi everyone. I'm Emma, and you're on the Stories by Emma channel. Let's dive into some amazing stories. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and share. Thank you. Without looking back, Jason stood in front of the dilapidated house, his breath catching in his throat. It had been nearly 15 years since he left the small town of Montgomery, Alabama, vowing never to return. But the call from his sister had torn down the walls he'd built around his past. Their mother, the fiercely independent woman who had raised them alone, was gone. And with her passing, the last connection Jason had to this place was severed. His sister Eva stood waiting on the porch, her eyes red from crying. The vibrant energy she once carried now drained and replaced by exhaustion. "I didn't think you'd actually come," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Jason's throat tightened as he approached, the weight of their shared history pressing on him. Memories of fights, slammed doors, and unresolved anger stirred just below the surface. Inside, the house smelled of dust and neglect. The living room looked exactly as he remembered. Stiff floral couches, mismatched curtains, and their mother's rocking chair by the window. "She never changed a thing," Eva murmured, walking ahead of him. Jason ran his hand along the peeling paint on the walls, trying to steady himself against the flood of emotions that threatened to overwhelm him. Sorting through their mother's belongings was more difficult than Jason had anticipated. Every drawer, every photograph, every piece of clothing was a reminder of the woman who had held their fractured family together. "She never stopped talking about you," Eva said softly, her fingers tracing the edge of an old family photo. Jason said nothing, guilt gnawing at him. He had left and never looked back. That night, after hours of tense silence, Eva finally broke down. "You think you can just show up here after all these years and everything's okay?" Jason, caught off guard, could feel the sting in her words. "I'm here now," he replied, knowing it wasn't enough. The years of distance, both physical and emotional, hung between them like an impenetrable barrier. In the days leading up to the funeral, tension simmered just beneath the surface. Jason tried to help, but every effort seemed to only deepen the divide between them. He watched as Eva handled the funeral arrangements with quiet efficiency, her grief hidden behind a wall of responsibility. She had clearly been carrying the weight of their mother's care, and their past, for far too long. The day of the funeral dawned under a dreary gray sky. Jason stood at the back of the church, feeling more like a stranger than family. The preacher's words echoed through the nearly empty space, but Jason found it hard to focus. His mind wandered to the countless times his mother had called, asking him to visit, to come home. He had always found a reason not to. At the graveside, Jason and Eva stood side by side, watching as the casket was lowered into the ground. "She would have wanted you here," Eva said quietly. Jason swallowed hard, his chest tightening with the weight of regret. "I know," he whispered, but knowing didn't make it any easier. The burden of all the lost years pressed down on him, suffocating. After the funeral, the house felt emptier than ever. Jason sat in their mother's rocking chair, staring out the window at the fading light. "I don't know why I came back," he muttered to himself. Eva, seated across from him, glanced up. "Because you needed to. We both did." Her voice was softer now, less accusatory, as if the funeral had drained the last of her anger. Jason nodded, but the guilt still clung to him like a shadow. He had left Eva to bear everything alone, the care of their mother, the burden of their past. "I should have been here," he said, breaking the heavy silence. Eva sighed. "You weren't. But you're here now. That has to count for something." For the first time in years, Jason felt a flicker of hope. As they packed away their mother's things, they found an old letter hidden inside a book. It was addressed to Jason, written years ago but never sent. His hand shook as he opened it, his mother's familiar handwriting covering the page. She had written about how proud she was of him, despite the distance, despite the time apart. Tears filled his eyes as he realized just how deeply she had loved him, even when he hadn't loved himself. "She forgave you a long time ago," Eva said gently, watching him as he wiped his face. Jason's heart ached with the weight of the words. "I never forgave myself," he admitted. Eva sat down beside him, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. "It's time you do," she whispered. Over the next few days they worked quietly side by side, packing away the remnants of their childhood and their mother's life. Slowly, the distance between Jason and Eva began to close. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. Jason had missed so much, but maybe, just maybe, they could begin to heal in the quiet of their mother's house. On the last day before Jason was set to leave, Eva handed him a small box. "Mom wanted you to have this," she said. Inside was their grandfather's old pocket watch. Jason held it, feeling the weight of family history in his palm. "Thank you," he whispered, knowing the watch was more than just an heirloom. It was a symbol of time and second chances. As Jason drove away from the house for the last time, he glanced in the rearview mirror. The house grew smaller and smaller until it disappeared from sight. He didn't know when or if he would ever come back. But for the first time in years, Jason felt lighter. He had returned, not for his mother but for himself, and maybe, just maybe, that was enough.